So my name is Stieg, and I'm a graduate student at Texas A&M, and I'm presenting preliminary work with Ken Meier, who's also at A&M. Changed the title from the program. So we're looking at the impact of management in public and private universities. Our research question at a general level, is management different within a public and private setting? But more so, what is the relative effectiveness in terms of outcomes of management between these two sectors? There's an extensive literature that examines public-private differences as far as organizational level. Increasingly, this has been looked at a management question, as performance-based systems have become more popular and privatization has been touted as the new way to increase efficiency and effectiveness in public organizations, especially with the rise of new public management. So typically typically publicness has been measured in three ways. So ownership, which is a simple dichotomous variable of public versus private. Funding, a matter of how much money you receive from government sources. The idea that if you're a contractor, you may actually receive more government money, but technically be within the private realm. And then also a level of social control, so how much autonomy do you have as far as the environment that you're working in. And obviously this has become especially relevant in the context of higher education, as again, we've seen these performance-based systems increase in popularity. So there's an extensive literature within the public sector that tells us that, yes, management matters. Some work done by my co-author, an extensive amount, that says that that's trying to theoretically explain if mechanisms within the public sector can be translated to the private sector. And so this has typically been looked at across four dimensions, because management is multifaceted, and so we divide this into four different ways that we're going to explain management. So the first being staff management. This is more of a conscious set of actions to coordinate actors towards performance goals amongst your entire staff within the organization. Also, line management, or typically defined as hierarchical management, so more of your superior subordinate within the line of the organization. Similarly to what we just heard, so there's a lot of research that's shown that managing in not only within your networking, not only within your organization, but also across and outside of your organization can work to deliver the program performance that you're looking for. And then additionally, a measure of tenure within the organization, with the assumption that the longer that you're in a certain type of organization, the better idea you're going to have about what's going to drive performance and what could you do to change the performance. So to look at these questions of is management different in public and private organizations, we're going to do this in the context of higher education. So why higher education? It's an interesting realm where we have organizations that have similar performance goals within both sectors, but also really interesting characteristics across the sector. So as far as that ownership measure that I was describing, there's a really strong political influence within public universities. Those that are at public institutions realize that the state control can have a substantial impact on the management of an organization. But at the same time, we're seeing quite a shift in higher education and where revenue comes from, and so it provides a realm where we can also look at the different measures of publicness as far as funding, which recent data has shown that this is increasingly becoming more tuition reliant, especially in public institutions as state funding has decreased. So it gives us a really neat opportunity to explore these definitions that have kind of been touted, but ownership is also often the most frequently used. So how do we go about this? In 2008-2009, a survey was conducted for 2 university presidents at 4-year institutions, so ranging from bachelor's to associate's degree granting institutions to very high research institutions, with an overall response rate of about 22%. And this is combined with institutional performance data from IPED's Delta Cost Project from 2008 to 2010, leading to about 245 institutions across 3 years of data. So how do we operationalize our independent variables, those management factors that I was discussing earlier. Presidents were asked how frequently they interact with a variety of both internal and external actors, and then a measure of their tenure as president. And we do a factor analysis based off of their responses to get those measures of line management, staff management, and then networking. And then we're also going to interact this, because this is our question of, does the interaction between sectors and management affect performance within higher education? So we're going to look at both the ownership measure, whether they're a public or private university, a simple dichotomous variable, but then also the percent of funds that they receive from public sources, including federal, state, and local grants and contracts. So briefly, I'll go through the factor analysis. The first one that we did was to measure staff and line management, and the two factors that loaded heavily, the first we can see is more of a measure of staff management, things like interacting with business affairs, legal affairs, so this would be a president's interaction with people within the organization, but across different departments, especially really highly development and fundraising, and then also their external affairs and PR. And so then our second factor, which we'll say is line management, we see more of the deans and department heads, who would be people who answer to the president within the line of the organization. Also, interestingly, we see student organizations and faculty organizations loading highly. So our measure for managerial networking, this one's going to tap into a little bit more of those connections outside of the organization. We have a variety of people that we ask the presidents, who are they interacting with, boards of regents, state agencies, federal agencies. Interestingly, which we'd like to explore further, is this interaction between the business leaders and community leaders, and then as well as other university presidents, the idea that you can communicate with people who are doing similar things to you to affect performance. So our dependent variables, if you've read our paper, there's a lot of exploration going on, and so we look both across measures of effectiveness and equity, which in higher education, performance is multifaceted, and organizations are attempting to do a lot at the same time. And so we're going to use the 6-year graduation rate, as well as completion rates, which is the number of degrees conferred per full-time enrollment students, as well as the percent of African American students and the percent of Hispanic students. Number of controls typically used in the higher education literature that I'd be happy to discuss later. So in a broad sense, looking at our paper, we see that when we do a joint F-test of significance across these management interactions with our publicness measure, for 6 out of 8 of our models, we are seeing a significant effect, illustrating that there is a difference between management within a public and private organization at a very broad level. And so I'm briefly going to walk through some of the results that we have. As I said, there's quite a bit in the paper, so I'm kind of picking and choosing some that illustrate what we're looking at. So a nice regression table that we can see, but this is the effective management on completion rates based off of that ownership measure, so our dichotomous 0-1 public-private. What we're really interested in is the interactions that are happening here between our management measurements and the publicness measure. And so within the paper, there's marginal effects plots that I've chosen to illustrate the marginal effect of managerial networking on completion rates, given that you're publicly owned. And so in the case of the x-axis, it's the 0 or 1 measure, 0 being private, 1 being public. And we can see that the marginal effect of networking, given that you're a private university, has a negative effect on completion rates. If we move to our other measure of publicness, funding, so the same effective management on the percent, or the completion rates based off of this funding measure. Again, we're interested in these interactions here, and so as a comparison, I've also illustrated the marginal effect of managerial networking on completion rates. So given that you have lower sources of public funding, there's what you see a negative effect, although as that increases, it becomes insignificant. So looking at our equity measures, effective management on the percent of Black students based off the funding. So this, again, is the ratio of public funding sources. And an interesting thing that we see here is that we see a significant negative effect of the funding from public sources, which we also see in the ownership table. And so interesting things happening here as far as the relationship between ownership and equity. When we look at the marginal effect of staff management on the percent of Black students, given public funding, we're seeing this negative trend, which we're trying to tap into some of the different relationships that we're seeing across our other equity measure that I'll explore further. And so an additional marginal effect plot. So the marginal effect of tenure on the percent Black students given public funding, so again, the ratio of public sources, the longer that you're at an institution, as public funding increases, the percent of Black students also increases. So some interesting things that we see here is that when we look at our other equity measure for the percent Hispanic students, we're seeing the opposite trend that we did for the percent Black students, indicating that there are differences in these student groups, something that we want to tap into a little bit more because performance as measured through graduation rates and completion rates has been the buzz in higher education. But there's something happening here with our equity measures that is relevant to higher education and is tapping into something that's an important question going forward as we try to increase access to higher education. So in conclusion, across the paper, we are still exploring additional data that we can be looking at and adding years of data, but we see that management impacts differ across public and private sector, as well as across organizational goals. These are complex organizations that have a lot of needs that they're trying to address, and we can see some of the tension just within this preliminary analysis. And as far as the definitions of public go, we see similar trends across the two measures of ownership and funding. And the implications preliminarily illustrate that private sector management may be different than public sector management, and we should proceed with caution when we translate these ideas between the two sectors. So, thank you.